Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Clear Values podcast. Today, it is my pleasure to be speaking with Erica Benner. Erica is a political philosopher who has held academic posts at St Antony's College, Oxford, the London School of Economics, and Yale University. She was awarded a DPhil by Oxford in 1993. She's also the author of several books, including this one that I've got here, Be Like the Fox, Machiavelli's Lifelong Quest for Freedom. Welcome to the podcast, Erica.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
So, your book is fascinating to me because, as I was saying just before we hit the record button on this call, Machiavelli is this sort of figure that I feel as though has been present with me in some way, shape, or form in my work life, and his ideas or the ideas that are espoused in The Prince are very real in the working world. And I recall back in the day, I say back in the day, this must have been like 2009 sort of time when I was setting up a business. My co-founder, who was older than me, and he was really the core founding partner, presented me with this book and said, I'd like you to read a book, Tom. And it was The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. And I'd already read it when I was at university, just off my own bat during the summer holidays. So I already knew what it was about, and I wasn't signed up to that way of doing things at all. So he and I were at odds really on several things. It didn't make for a great partnership because we had differences of opinions in terms of how to do business, so to speak. And then in other instances as well, Machiavelli has come up and people use this phrase time and time again, don't they? Oh, he's Machiavellian, she's Machiavellian, this is Machiavellian. Let's wind this all back and talk first of all then about who Niccolò Machiavelli was, because you've got an interesting take on Machiavelli's work and who he was. Let's focus then on who Machiavelli actually was, the time that he lived in, and what his role was.
Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. He was from what we'd probably call a sort of upper middle class family that had fallen on hard times, and probably for political reasons in part, because his family, some members of his family had been opposing the ruling family of Florence at the time, the Medici. And later on in life, Machiavelli became a civil servant and served the Florentine Republic for some years until the Medici, who had been in and out of Florence as its rulers, came back and closed down the Republican government that Machiavelli had been working for, and sent him into exile, which is when he wrote his famous Prince.
Mm. So he wrote The Prince in exile. Let's talk about The Prince then, because what was The Prince? Was this just something that Machiavelli just felt like writing just because he had it in his head and he had to get it out there for general readership? What was it specifically? What was Machiavelli's purpose for writing The Prince, and who was it addressed to?
Well, this is a subject of much debate, and I disagree with probably most contemporary readers of Machiavelli, but agree with a lot of much earlier readers of Machiavelli, that he wrote it not as a serious attempt to kind of win favor with the Medici. He dedicated it to a Medici prince called Lorenzo. And so many people kind of assumed that he was writing The Prince after having been booted out of government in Florence in order to kind of get back in with the family who are now ruling. That's the sort of general view of Machiavelli. You know, he was kind of going back and bootlicking a bit because he was so desperate to get back into politics after being chucked out. He basically wrote The Prince about a year after being chucked out of government, when he was kind of persona non grata in the Florentine government buildings, wasn't allowed to go there at all. And so the usual view is, well, he's writing this telling the Medici how to be really realistic if they want to consolidate their power, because their rule had been really, really contested in Florence. It hadn't been a stable time for the Medici. They had come to power by what were considered illegitimate means by a lot of people. They had turned what was a free sort of democratic republic in Florence into a principality, an authoritarian state, not a brutal one, but definitely an authoritarian state under their control. And Machiavelli's family had been among the most prominent families opposing them. We have big questions about Machiavelli's own involvement, but he was born when the Medici were very much in power. They were kicked out when he was in his early 20s, and that's when Machiavelli himself first enters into politics. And he becomes a very loyal servant of the anti-Medici Republic of Florence, who, one of whose main tasks was to keep the Medici, who were in exile in Rome and other cities, from coming back, because they had constantly been trying to sort of take over the state as their own kind of, private property. People like Machiavelli and his family were opposed to that. He wrote The Prince only after, as I think I mentioned, the Medici were kicked out 18 years after Machiavelli had started working for the Republic of Florence, and but they came back when he was in his early 40s, and they closed down the Republican government, kicked out the main leader at the time, who was very close to Machiavelli, and Machiavelli was the only other person in the government who actually lost his job. They let everybody else sort of stay in as long as they do their bidding, but Machiavelli, his boss, and his personal assistant were singled out, chucked out of government, and Machiavelli was forbidden to come anywhere near the government buildings for the foreseeable future. And he wrote The Prince almost a year after that, having been arrested by the Medici family, who had recently come back. They had found evidence of a conspiracy against them. Machiavelli's name was on a list of possible conspirators, although it was never proven he had conspired against them. They threw him into prison, they tortured him, he was about to be executed, and then there was a reprieve, an amnesty was declared, Machiavelli and other political prisoners were released. And it wasn't that long after that, he retreats to his farm, and then writes a letter to a friend saying, I've written a little book on principalities. I wonder if I should show it to the Medici. So that's not to answer. There's no simple answer to the question of what was this book about, because he doesn't tell you exactly what it's about. And it's so ambiguous in so many ways. If you read it in a good translation or in the original Italian, you realize this is not a straightforward boom, boom, I'm giving you some simple rules to kind of, grab and hold states. It's much more complicated than that. So the early suspicion of a lot of early readers like Rousseau and Italian readers even before that was that he was actually being kind of, it's a bit of a send up and a bit of a wind up, but also a way of kind of satirizing what princes do when they behave the way the Medici did.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was the question that was on the tip of my tongue, actually. Was this book a satire? And is he just being ironic in writing this? Because it seems to me, and I get this from reading your book, that Machiavelli was a Republican, which is very, very different to the likes of the Medici and their regime, which is very much autocratic and, kings and queens or whatever. I don't know if there were any Medici. I don't know the role of women in the Medici, but I imagine that it was primarily male dominated. So this is interesting then, because people still read The Prince today, like my friend, and they take it as a series of axioms, or they take the aphorisms from The Prince and they'll say, right, well, almost like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and they'll say, right, well, in this situation, this is what you need to do. Because, like you say, the Prince itself is very circumstantial. Machiavelli sets up different scenarios and situations in the book. So you have to be somewhat versed in the history, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If you just get like some, I don't know, a high school kid or a university student like I was, just picking it up off the shelf and reading it, there's a lot of context that is not necessarily known. That's why, like I was saying before, there was a whole module, there was a whole special subject on my history degree about Machiavelli's Italy, because you need to understand the context of the time, the milieu in which he lives, and the different power dynamics. So what do you make of that? Because I think it's interesting that people do seem to get on pretty well with, say they get on pretty well. They seem to be able to manipulate power and use power, or you might say abuse power, through using these aphorisms and axioms. So what do you reckon, if you do have such an opinion, what do you think Machiavelli might make of that? Do you think that he might say, well, fair enough, what I was saying was actually fairly common sense if that's the way that you choose to operate. But he's not necessarily saying that's a virtuous way of operating. How would you see it?
Well, I mean, this is really, really important. What you said about how most people don't know the examples that he uses. And Machiavelli writes, like, he gives you these axioms, and that's what he's famous for, because that's what seems to us to like resonate. It's what we see people do. It's stuff that we don't need to know an example, or cite particular examples to say, it's better to be feared than loved, or, sometimes you have to be not good in order to get what you want. You think, oh yeah, that's what politicians all do. That must be what Machiavelli's just being honest about it. But what what he also has in the book is examples. He'll say that kind of thing, and then he'll say, and here's an example of someone who'd used that advice, and look at what a great success story they were. And if you know most of his examples, not just a few of them, almost every single example of a prince, ancient, modern, of his own times, actually was a failure in some way or other. And Machiavelli hints at this in like the subtlest ways. But there are a lot of cases where we think, oh, this is his model prince, because he actually said, I do not know how to reproach Cesare Borgia, who appears in chapter 7. I don't know how to reproach him. He had he did all this stuff. It was so dazzling. It was so hyperactive. It was so impressive. People were like stupefied and didn't know what to do. And you read that and you think, okay, this is a guy he likes. Here we're going to get a real story about what Machiavelli thinks is good politics. But then he kind of says at the end, oh, but Cesare ended up, what happened to him? I mean, he was so powerful for a little while, but then it turns out his dad, who was the Pope and who'd given him all his power and his army and his money and everything to make him successful, his dad dies. And everyone at the time knew that this dad was probably poisoned by the other popes. um, and then Cesare just falls down and nobody ever hears from him again. That's it. And so, anybody in Machiavelli's time reading that, it was really recent. Machiavelli knew Cesare Borgia personally. He'd had to be, like in diplomatic, kind of circles with him, trying to persuade him, please don't invade my city of Florence. That was Machiavelli's job for a while, was going to talk to Cesare and beg him not to invade his own beloved city and turn it into a Borgia like stronghold. Everyone would have known that Machiavelli was being ironic. And what he's doing there, to answer your, the question really, is he's letting he's trying to get readers to see for themselves and judge for themselves the actions and the deeds. And part of the trick of the prince it's a very old trick that you also see in ancient writings. It's like the writer is going to sort of give you the words of a character or tell you in his own words, this guy is great. And then he's going to show you the deeds. And then you have to think about the outcome. And did this actually succeed in a serious way? And let's say you get, like in chapter 19 of The Prince, he talks about a lot of Roman emperors. And a lot of Roman emperors survived. Some of them didn't get murdered, although a lot of them did. But even if they survived and they succeeded and they died peacefully in bed, what happened to their country? It was ruined. It was ravaged. The Republic was dead. Freedom was dead for ages. And if you want to get those views that Machiavelli, the Republican ones that you mentioned, all you have to do is look at everything else he wrote apart from this tiny little book, The Prince, which is a genius book, absolutely brilliant if you get it right. But what he really spent most of his time writing about was republics and how to help them survive and how threatened they are by people like the Medici, Julius Caesar, others we could mention today, and how carefully you need to study their different methods. And I think that's what The Prince is about.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Understanding the outcomes. I say this to people all the time. I mean, I work in relation to values. This podcast very much focuses on values. I do mentoring work as well, which does focus on helping people to understand what their values are and create a hierarchy of values in their own lives. And one thing that I say to people time and time again, because you don't want to preach to anybody at all, it's not very effective. One thing that is effective, though, in helping people to understand and uncover what they actually really want for themselves is if you're going to go on a certain path, if you're going to set somebody up as a role model or as a guide or a paragon or an example of anything, look at the outcomes that they had in their life or in their administration, in their particular pursuit of something, their stewardship of something, and see what the results are, because the results will give you a very big clue as to whether you actually want to go in that direction or not. It's not just about, I think people get blinded, especially with social media being as it is today. It's very flashy, it's very shiny. There's a lot of curation, there's a lot of setup, there's a lot of falsity and a lot of deception that goes on in all of this as well. So people are very good, talk about dazzling the courts. That's what people are doing every day when they get on Instagram or TikTok. They're dazzling the viewers to get attention, to get clicks, to get likes and everything else. So there's a lot of smoke and mirrors out there, and I think it is very, very important, like you say, to look at the outcomes. I wonder if, and I'm sure you mentioned this in your book. It's been a little while since I read it, so I can't directly adduce anything that would speak to this. But I'm just wondering if we can do that in terms of Machiavellian scholarship, in terms of making these points, really hammering these points. And I'm sure you do it in your book as well. From recollection, I can't pick out any specific examples, but this is the sort of thing that I think is really important, because at the moment you've got this book which is kind of on the shelves. It's a Penguin classic, and it sells goodness knows how many copies every single year. And yet, at best, people are going to read the preface to it, which is probably going to be about 5 to 10 pages. And they're not going to understand the full context of this thing. They're just not going to get that information. But I think it's also interesting to think about people who did who were influenced by Machiavelli in terms of, from a contemporaneous point of view, because you bring in an example at the start of the book, which is Thomas Cromwell. And so tell us a bit about Thomas Cromwell, who he was, and what influence the prince had on him, because I think this is a really interesting anecdote.
I don't, did I mention Thomas Cromwell? I mentioned Reginald Pole. Cardinal Reginald Pole was
Yeah, yeah,
was
the beginning of the book.
actually,
Yeah,
involved in the Hilary Mantel. She, famous
yeah,
especially to the world from the Hilary Mantel wonderful trilogy. I mean, I'll talk more about the Reginald Pole, if I may.
yeah. Go ahead. Yeah,
Because Thomas Cromwell, people will know much better and can find out much better than from me. Just read Hilary Mantel's amazing
yes,
novels. But Cardinal Reginald Pole was a Catholic, obviously cardinal at the time of Thomas Cromwell and King Henry VIII. And he actually wrote, he's one of the first people who wrote down a comment about the book that became known as Machiavelli's Prince, because another interesting point is Machiavelli's Prince was not published. You asked at the beginning, obviously didn't have to publish it for, some sort of, get it out onto the press. It was not published in his lifetime at all. In fact, very few things he wrote were, one few of his sort of major writings. And Thomas Cromwell, not Cromwell, Reginald Pole visited Florence, he says, and he came across it just because he met some people who knew the Medici, because the Medici were very involved in the Catholic Church. He knew them. And he came across a draft of this book, which was just circulating. It was out there, people passing it around. And he said, I opened it and I just thought, oh my God, I saw the hand of Satan, he says. This is a satanic book, a satanic person. And he said it was so awful that he just thought, how could anyone get away with writing this? And why are people reading it? And he said, I asked some people that I knew, and they said, no, the author was actually a decent man, but he hated the Medici so much. And he wrote this to kind of bring them down. So that was the idea, that it's a kind of Trojan horse book, that Machiavelli's giving advice under the guise of it being realistic, because it's true that if you follow some of his advice, as he says, and he says this, if you want to win power really fast and really quickly and really easily, just do this super realistic, brutal, ruthless, deceptive thing. Be immoral, and that will get you to the top super fast. If you want to stay there, that's a different matter. But most people don't even read that far because they're just worried about being in a hurry, getting to the top. And they don't read the kind of little things between the lines where they carry on and patiently kind of get Machiavelli's take on how do you stabilize yourself. Now, Reginald Pole didn't see the whole thing because he was so horrified, but he kind of gives a hint that's kind of gone down in history that, there was this view of Machiavelli as being very critical of the Medici. That's the first thing he heard about it in Florence, 9 years after Machiavelli's death or so.
Mm.
And he was actually trying to give advice that exposes the follies of princes who are too much in a hurry or who overdo it because they're so ambitious and so greedy that they just, think ends justify the means, ends, my ends, whatever they might be.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of other people around the same time who were Republicans as well as Machiavelli, or who were anti-Catholic, because that's the main reason the Catholic Church Catholic Church actually banned all of Machiavelli's books, all of them, when they set up the index of prohibited books a couple of decades after Machiavelli's death. Machiavelli was one of the first people to be on the list. He was dead for a long time, but every single thing he wrote was on the list of prohibited books, exceptionally. And that stayed the case until the 19th century. He was officially banned by the Catholics. And one of the reasons is you just have to look at chapter 11 of The Prince and read it thinking maybe he's not deadly serious. Maybe he is actually a critic of the Catholic Church and the Pope Alexander VI, who was the father of Cesare Borgia. Read it again in the light of events of the world today, where we see people trying to grab power by lying, cheating, being as ruthless as they can, dumping their allies as soon as it seems inconvenient, coming back to them when they want them again. It's all there in The Prince. And the chapter 11 on ecclesiastical polities kind of is very critical of the church. I also recommend very strongly, in the light of today's events, chapter 21, especially the first paragraph about Ferdinand of Aragon, who sounds a lot like a certain American politician in his hyperactivity and ability to dazzle people with all the kind of weird, crazy things he's doing. And read that again and think, does this sound like satire or does this sound really serious? These are things you're going to think it's serious if you come to Machiavelli with the modern image we have of this very cold, realistic advisor to princes, just get power. But if you come to him in the kind of spirit that we're getting a lot of now, which is we're in a scary world. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of princely people wanting to grab power for themselves and take it by any means. Maybe it will open people's minds a bit and they'll start making these connections.
Yeah, definitely. Because that's the thing, isn't it? It's one thing for people to learn lessons from history, and it can be incredibly valuable for people to learn lessons from history, principles from history. But if what they derive as learning is not the intended lesson to be learned or the intended principle to be gleaned, that can be quite dangerous. And I think that's what we've seen writ large with Machiavelli, isn't it? It's probably one of the most egregious examples of that, of almost an abuse of history where we're saying, okay, right, well, human beings, we tend to operate very much in the short term. So coming back to this question of values, people want things now. They don't want to wait necessarily. They don't want to do the work and build up their reputation, build trust, build alliances through mutual trust and through, okay, I'm actually going to do what I say I'm going to do. I'm going to help you. I'm going to be supportive. I'm going to produce good outcomes and make good contributions. I'd rather just get it done now. So Machiavelli, used in a literal sense, as many people have taken him literally, without the satirical angle. This is about the short term, isn't it? And that I think is the key point. It's yeah, if you want to seize power like right now, today, or in this moment, do this. This is the way to do it. But in the long term, the joke's on you because actually this is gonna leave a train wreck behind you because this approach is not just gonna damage things around you, but you're gonna destroy yourself through it ultimately. I think that's what I get from it.
Fantastic. That's exactly how I see it. And when I say that's how I see it, I'm never going to say this is the right way to do it. This is the right way to read Machiavelli, because I think he didn't expect to be read as much as and discussed as much or followed as much as people have done in the future. But I think he did want people to judge for themselves, because as you said very wisely earlier on, people don't, knowledge doesn't stick unless you learn it yourself. And he says
Mm.
that theory actually as well, that like there are three kinds of brains, and the best brains are the ones who learn for themselves and don't take it on someone
Mm,
else's authority. So he's not preaching, he's not lecturing, saying this guy was evil, this guy was, a train wreck. He's saying, just look at the examples, study them, and judge for yourself. And I might throw in some words of praise or words that sound like really, wow, this is great, grandezza, or this was marvelous. And,
mm,
and actually, all those words, if you look at his ancient sources, because he's imitating a lot of ancient writers as well, they're all like double-edged words. Like to say somebody was, wow,
mm.
that was great, often is like the kind of greatness you're seeking before you go too far, you get hubris and you fall.
Yeah.
So this is a really important point. And let me just say too, like as a tip for anyone wanting to read Machiavelli again and start like chapter 1 of The Prince, look at what he says in chapter 1. He says there are two ways that princes can get power.
Mm.
One is by fortune, fortuna,
Yes.
and others' arms. Fortune is paired with other people's arms, or
Mm,
by virtue, and he doesn't say what that is. You're supposed to work it out for yourself, and your own arms. So it's either by relying on other people, like Cesare Borgia did with his dad, the Pope, who gave him everything, and then he collapses when he's gone, or you rely on yourself. But what it takes to rely on yourself and maintain power is complicated. Like you said, it involves like having to make alliances, having to be patient, having to work
mm,
really, really hard and not be lazy and not expect other people to do it for you, not looking for shortcuts. And Machiavelli also says, and pay attention if you go back and read it as well, to when he says, it's a couple of chapters on, but he says, if you want to get to power fast, follow fortune. Just rely on fortune. That'll take you really high, really fast. If you want to maintain your power, whoa, gets hard. It's going to be hard work, guys.
mm.
It's
So,
it's
so
it's just you
yeah,
just cherry pick and go and just look for those key things, you know?
yeah, yeah. So what does just to be explicit about fortune then? What
Yeah.
exactly does he mean by that? How would you define fortune as Machiavelli intended it to be understood?
Well, I don't think it's as mystical and mysterious as people usually think. All those weird, Renaissance people with their kind of, strange mythical ideas of fortune. He's not a mythically minded guy. And
Mm,
he uses the idea of fortune in his other writings in a more specific way. And the main thing he means by it is, well, what I said, he spells it out at the beginning of chapter 6 in the print. Fortune is relying on or 6 or 7, is basically when you rely on other people's troops, money, and
mm,
good fortune, their good fortune.
yeah.
And you rely heavily, everyone relies a little bit on other people for the success, but if you do it too much, you can think you go fast. But the main thing about fortune that Machiavelli says is it never stays in one place for long. And of course,
Mm,
this is a very ancient idea too. It's not something he made up. It comes from the ancient Greeks, it comes to the Romans. When they talk about luck or fortune, they say fortune's fine, but if you rely on it, you're going to be messed up because it goes here one day. You might be the biggest power ever for, 450 years, like Rome, but if you get too powerful and you don't keep thinking about maintaining your power in a way that takes other people into consideration
mm,
and takes seriously if they're not happy or gets too confident in your own right to be there, then it's going to come and hit you pretty fast, at some point pretty quickly, and you're going to
mm,
fall. Machiavelli's very, very much on that view of fortune. It's not like Fortune's a woman, beat her to a pulp. He plays with that image because in the whole chapter where he talks about that, he's taking on the persona of a kind of Prince of Fortune, who's like this young guy in a hurry who thinks, let fortune bring me good or bad luck. If she brings me bad luck, I'll beat her to a pulp and, overcome it. Also, remember, this is another thing about Machiavelli, very dear to my heart and very important. He's a dramatist. He's a brilliant,
mm,
brilliant literary guy. He's not just an advisor to princes. The first piece of work we've heard, we get a record of him having written, but we don't have it. It's lost. Was a hilarious satirical drama about events in Florence. And we know this because his grandson or nephew, and we're not sure which, was the executor for his literary estate after he died. And he makes a note of this and describes a little bit of it, but he hid it because of the Catholic Church banning Machiavelli's writings. So he
Mm,
and other works he kind of amended. He chopped bits out. He chopped bits out of the prints, trying to make it acceptable. He chopped bits out of the discourses. But this piece was so scandalous, apparently, that he
mm,
blocked it. And Machiavelli wrote a very, very funny play called The Mandragola, which is still performed today, which is also a political satire. So
mm,
I think it's really important to realize that in the prince, there's lots of this drama, theatrical, comic
mhm.
writing going on.
Yeah, yeah. It's just it's so interesting to hear this from you, Erica, because obviously I've read your book and I got that your interpretation of Machiavelli is very, very different from the mainstream interpretation. But what I find quite baffling, to be honest, is that there are people at elite business schools in the United States that are teaching to follow the aphorisms of the prince as though they are good ways to obtain and retain power. And they clearly don't understand this. They're clearly just trotting out, and these are academics as well, very highly esteemed, and they're trotting this out and teaching this, the best and the brightest of the younger generations that this is how you should be to get power. And it's mind-boggling. I don't understand why these folks haven't paid more attention to the sort of detail that you're talking about. Who was Machiavelli? Where was he? What was the context? You don't have to be a historian, but what of critical thinking? What of even due diligence, right? If you're gonna espouse somebody's work, much less recommend somebody's work to students and impressionable minds, surely then you should do your due diligence and make sure you actually understand what it is that this author was where he was coming from, what he was talking about, and ultimately what's going on here. Because this point about this short-termism, in terms of yeah, fine, grab it in the short term, but it's bad for the long term. I mean, this is what we've been riddled with in such a problematic way the world over, throughout business, throughout politics. And if these best and brightest who've gone into positions of power have been imbibed in a view of Machiavelli and the Prince that says this is the way to be, almost like in a principle related way, then there's no wonder why we have so many issues with short-termism. There's no wonder why people are just trying to grab stuff in the short term without due consideration of the long term. So how can we kind of evangelize a bit more about your take on Machiavelli and a more accurate reading of it, if I can say so?
I've been trying to sort of not say this, but I'm just as we speak, like within the last 5 days, I'm supposed to be writing 2 books on the Peloponnesian War. That's what I've been kind of on hold for a long time. I really was getting into it, reading all my Greek stuff again. But the last 5 days, I just got like, oh no, I just got to rewrite the Prince in a way that uses examples, like using Machiavelli's basic structure, his basic concepts, his ideas, but translating them a little bit, but in a not academic way, just like make it, and then replacing the examples that are kind of obscure now with things that people know. And it could be like a couple of really famous ancient examples most people know about, Julius Caesar, Nero, it doesn't have to be and not going into detail because Machiavelli doesn't either. He just gives you some examples and then some contemporary examples. And it's just, I've been doing this for 5 days obsessively, and I shouldn't say anything because I'm not sure it will come out or when, but I expect it will. And I don't know if this is, I just think it will make it so much clearer. As soon as you read The Prince with the kind of concepts that get mystified or that sound like, oh, that's just a weird Renaissance way of saying good luck or whatever, and with examples that are recognizable, then there'll be a lot more people going, oh yeah, and it doesn't even have to be people who are interested in learning about Machiavelli. It's just people who want to say, okay, leaders, great leaders trying to be princes. Let's see what the advice is. So that's one way. I mean, there's so many ways. I've already written 3 previous books about Machiavelli, by the way. That's the one you've got as the third. So I've got 2 like really academic ones that go into great detail, trying to explain a lot of the stuff I've just been saying. So it's kind of a mission for me and probably for the same reasons you say that, although I got no business background, it's the fact that people think they use Machiavelli as a sort of spokesperson, an intelligent, brilliant, classic spokesperson for a kind of selfish realpolitik that has
Mhm.
now taken over the world. I mean, it's been a big, people always say, oh, it was his times. He lived in these horrible times when people were so violent. But actually, the worst violence has happened since the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century,
Mm.
with the rise of organized realpolitik in the form of extreme nationalism. And we're seeing
Yeah.
that a lot now. And we have a lot of regimes in the world that are very, very dedicated to principles of ends justify the means, and the ends are us. And no matter
Yes.
what we do to treat, however we treat other people,
Mm.
the justification is our own power or our own allegedly, threatened survival. And that is a blot that is affecting people's morals on a personal level, on a business level. It's screwing up the world, frankly,
Yeah.
that people do have this idea. So I think probably one of my missions in revealing this more critical Machiavelli is exactly what you said, like just to show that this supposedly great defender of realpolitik of this in this form was its biggest and most brilliant critic.
Mm.
Unfortunately, he was forced to write it in a way that was kind of a
Mm.
bit dissimulated.
Yes.
So I think it is up to us to kind of try to bring out the deeper message of what he's saying.
Yeah, it's like so many other things as well, isn't it? It's as though his brilliance is lost on the masses. It's as though the masses have kind of got hold of these aphorisms and these phrases, and they've recreated Machiavelli in their heads. They've created him in their own image in a way, and so they've made him. Oh, he's Machiavelli's the father of real politics, so to speak. I mean, some of
Yeah.
these books behind me, you can see some of the books on my shelf. The book Power by Robert Greene, which is very popular. Frankly, there's some pretty nasty stuff in there that's espoused as being good, right? And Machiavelli is mentioned quite significantly. But clearly Machiavelli wasn't about that. And this is the thing, I think the truth matters. We're living in a time where you mention about the ends justifies the means, but we're also living in a time where it seems like might is right, and that if I've got the power, if I've got the strength, if I can, metaphorically, if one country can beat up another country, it seems like that's fair enough. That's okay, and we can just rewrite history and say why the aggressor was the aggressor and blame it on the victim instead, because actually the aggressor's the more powerful one. So we'll just go along with this narrative. And to me, the truth still matters. I don't care about this whole idea of, might is right and everything else. But like you say, and I think this is such an important point, that the way that things have been done in politics and in business around might is right, the ends justifying the means, it does affect the individual. It does affect individual people. It informs people. It educates people. We don't have the same sort of grounding, and I'm not getting preachy or anything here. It just is what it is. But people don't have any sort of philosophical or religious grounding in the West like they used to do. They just don't now. Some will, some won't. But writ large across the piece, they tend not to. So they are going to be going on what they see from political leaders, from influencers, from all these other people, and a lot of it is really not good. So I think, although you don't have a business background, Erica, I think you could get a lot of purchase by talking to people at business schools to disabuse people of the notion of short-termism, because so many of these institutions talk about, oh, we want sustainability, we want to be about the long term, we want to be about the whole, we want to expand the time frame that people look at things. We don't just want to focus on this really narrow quarterly earnings or whatever. Well, okay, let's then look at the philosophical basis of how we're operating here, right? Let's look at actually what are the principles that we're adhering to here. And on that regard, Erica, just following on from that, I wonder what your thoughts are on Machiavelli's own views about how to obtain power sustainably. What did he have to say about that? What were his views on how to get power in a sustainable, I would say even benevolent way, and maintain it also?
Well, he's in The Prince. If you look for these bits in The Prince, if people could step back and instead of looking for like, oh, what there's Machiavellian. What's the Machiavellian thing I can cherry pick? Look for the non-Machiavellian. Look at the things that look unfamiliar. And that's when you start. That's how I did it. That's how I came to it. Because I used to read it cherry picking because I had to teach it. And I had to teach it and I didn't know much about it. And I'd go in and cherry pick and then say, hang on. At some point, I'd start saying, hang on, there are these bits that are totally anti-Machiavellian. And actually, when you start looking, there are loads of them. And the key points are collaboration. I mean, I actually end up, I mean, I've written about this elsewhere, but I make a distinction between like unilateral realism and collaborative realism. And the unilateral realism, self-explanatory. It's like me, my ends justify the means. Let's go for it, whatever happens. And that's realistic. You've got to look out for yourself, first of all. If you don't molest them, they'll molest you, which is, by the way, not Machiavelli. It comes from Thucydides, who I'm also working on a lot, who, who gives that quote to Alcibiades and various other Athenians who end up self-destroying. They destroy very dramatically their own power by acting on that principle. And Machiavelli is in that tradition. But what he says, Machiavelli, is, you've got to collaborate, whether it's with people inside your own polity or whether it's with allies abroad. You are not going to sustain your power if you decide you are going to monopolize power inside your own state as an individual who wants to be a great prince, or as a party who says, I'm going to knock everybody else out. If you're in a republic, you've got to share power. He uses that word sharing a lot in all his other works. Even if you don't like it, hold your nose and share power and collaborate, and especially with allies. And again, Prince, chapter 21, read it. If you read it all the way through, he'll tell you about the importance of allies and how if you try to play fast and loose with your allies and just, you're opportunistic, take them when you want them, dump them when you don't want them, play around. It's a very simple piece of reasoning. No one's going to trust you. No one's going to like you. And in the end, you're going to be isolated. And it doesn't matter how powerful you thought you were at the beginning. Your power is in your working with other people over a sustainable period of time. You can be powerful for a while, abusing others or treating them fast and loose, but not for long. I mean, I'm surprised that I'm surprised. I kind of always assumed that these business schools and even some of these power sort of, with airport books were teaching some of that as well. I assumed that they were not being too
Yeah,
simplistic, but you can
yeah.
just say,
Well,
it's like
yeah,
so.
well, yeah. This is the sort of bifurcation that we've got. On the one hand, we've got these people who are talking about, the real hard stuff, the Machiavellian stuff, and the controversial stuff, and this is how to basically manipulate people to get what you want. So you've got that kind of strand, but then on the other hand, you've got this really fluffy, airy, fairy platitudinous angle. And what we really need is we really need to have a proper conversation where we actually bring these two things together and say, right, these are the dark arts over here. And so in a way, you've got to give the devil his due. So you've got to say, actually, you've got to say, you know what, if you do things this particular way, if you do things in this sort of unilateral, self-interested way, where I'm just going to superimpose my will on everyone and just plow through, then maybe in the short term you're going to get something from that. There could be some gains in the short term, but what is it going to do to you tomorrow? How is it going to affect your reputation? How's it going to affect your relationships? How's it going to affect your trustworthiness or how people perceive you as trustworthy or not? So it's those sort of things. And the guys on the other side who talk in platitudes, with them it's like they pretend that stuff doesn't exist, and that's problematic, because the issue with that then is that the people on this other side that are espousing these things just deride the people that pretend it doesn't exist because they don't engage with it. And so this is the thing. This is why I do this podcast as well. It's because I want people to think about values in relation to their own lives. I actually want them to engage with this stuff through their own critical thinking, through their own skills, their own cognition, rather than just, like you say, yeah, people pick books up all the time and they take what is written in them at face value without doing any critical thinking. I mean, a load of these books behind me, some of them I think are very dark, and I really don't agree with them at all in different ways. But I appreciate them because they've helped me to understand what my values are and what they aren't. And this is the thing. I personally, I'm going on a bit of a soapbox period here, but but I think we need more of that in a world that is so full of distractions, temptations, and challenges. We need this critical thinking. We don't just put ourselves away in, in these cosseted environments and say, oh no, I don't, that's bad and I'm going to stay away from that, or that's good and just do this. No, we have to be exposed. We have to be aware of these things, but then we have to make good informed decisions and choices about how we're going to do this. Like you say about your work on Machiavelli, you've spent, no doubt, a very long time studying. Yeah, exactly.
I'm such a nice, cheerful person.
And that's the thing. So that's the thing. You've spent so long on this, but yet it's so easy. It's like it's too easy for people to get a little bit of information and get misled by a little bit of information, as they say, a little bit of knowledge. That's it. A little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, isn't that the saying?
Yeah, but can I say, and I was thinking this before when you were talking about, you said the masses have got Machiavelli wrong and it's the masses who have done it wrong. But then you also said that these people are
Yeah,
teaching
true.
schools. And let me say, as
Yeah.
a Machiavelli scholar who's written two very, 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 very intense scholarly books on Machiavelli in just dissecting and contextualizing and everything, I know a lot of wonderful Machiavelli scholars. There are a lot who teach in all the big universities and around the world, and we tend to know a lot of us know each other because they're not that many of us and their conferences and stuff, and we all disagree, and this is the problem. I mean, we all disagree. Some of us very, very strongly, and some of the most distinguished and famous Machiavelli scholars out there who are a little bit older than me and they're men. I love them all, believe me. We totally disagree about some of it. Sometimes we agree on some things. There are some scholars who agree that Machiavelli was basically a Republican, but they also think he was serious about the prince because they don't get the ironies and they don't have the same classical references that I look at to see it. Maybe not the same sense of humor, and others see Machiavelli as totally a teacher of evil, and they think that that was just what he did. They don't blame him for that. They say that's the condition of the world, and he's saying something very real that we need to know, some dark truths about the world. So it's not as simple as just do a little studying, and this is where I don't think it's the masses, whatever that means. Machiavelli also has a word that gets translated into English as the vulgar. The vulgar don't know, but the vulgar doesn't mean the same thing as like the unwashed, uneducated masses. It means just people who don't bother to think deeply enough and who are a little bit trying to be sophisticated but don't really know.
Dilettantes, maybe.
Yeah, dilettantes, or just he was thinking of people in his own time who consider, and he has says this in the discourses, there are people in Florence who consider themselves very sophisticated and educated. There are people more upper class than himself, but
Mm,
actually they're not that interested in taking the time to really think for themselves. So all
mm,
Machiavelli cares about, and all I care about, because I'm completely the opposite of an academic snob, which really pisses off a lot of my academic colleagues and always has done. I don't think they know best. I don't think I know best. Um,
mm,
I think that the best thinking is done by people who just have the patience and the passion to think for themselves, or the kind of concerns and or the kind of concerns you have of somebody who's like concerned about values and humanity and trying to kind of help people think about that. You never said, I'm trying to educate people about that. You said, it's important that people think about that. And that's the spirit. I think we need more people who are going to teach, if that's the word, or introduce people to values or to, thinkers like Machiavelli who are difficult, not by preaching, but
mm,
saying, yeah, here it is. Look again. Here's some things to look out for. Uh, if I write what I'm doing now, like a rewriting of The Prince, I'll just give you some different examples. This is my take. See if it works for you, then go back and see what you think.
yeah.
And there's so many inventive ways we have to come up with now to get people to think ourselves out of the horrible divisions and boxes and
Mm,
corrupt ways of thinking
yes.
that we got into. And I
Mm,
think that's something where, as you've mentioned, internet, and I think a lot of young people I talk to, especially my students, kids and my friends, they see through BS a lot
yes.
more easily than people my generation. Really, they
Mm,
just do because they're brought up being bombarded with it all the time. And this is an opportunity that we can kind of try to get people to rethink. But I'm glad you think Machiavelli is a good place to, like, one of the good places where people can start like critically thinking again about what's going to bring sustainable solutions to conflict, sustainably decent ways of life for people.
Mm.
Because right now the world is being, of course, assaulted by people who have all sorts of power right now to take all that away from the rest of us. And but Machiavelli would, I think, still look at it and say, well, the Roman Empire looked like that, and it worked for a while,
Yeah.
but not forever. And then, then it blew up. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, it reminds me of Shelley's poem Ozymandias. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair, and that's just some ruins in the middle of a desert from some erstwhile empire. And I think of that, and I think, well, yeah, because you might be great today, but what about tomorrow? Because tomorrow is going to come. And like you said, and this is the point that this point about fortune that Machiavelli makes as well is that yeah, fortune that's going to come in swings and roundabouts, but it's not going to be there forever. And so you better have your house in order for when it's not in your favor because you just can't rely on it being there the whole time. I also think as well, just going back to your point about ways of reading Machiavelli, I think it's interesting in terms of the humorous aspect of it. I've got some colleagues that I work with who are linguists, and one of them, she's half Spanish, and she's read Don Quixote and Cervantes, I think that is, and also Dante's Inferno, and um, she's spoken to me. I've not read them. I've read little bits of Dante's Inferno, but she's always remarked to me when she's talked about those books about how funny they are, how much humor there is in them, and so humor at that particular time, similar sort of time periods, I guess, to Machiavelli. And so humor is a feature of that sort of classical writing, and actually reference to classical, as in Greeks and Romans, was much more prevalent than it is now. We don't get taught these things in school now. These reference points these things that Machiavelli was referring to are not well known. Even with Nietzsche, for example, in the 19th century, you wouldn't necessarily get people understanding the references that he's drawing on because it doesn't get taught in school anymore. It's just not as widely known. So we struggle sometimes when we look at the past out of context. But I think it's a great place to finish on, Erica, in terms of that reflection about what are your values. It's a question for everyone. It's a question that I have asked myself, and I do ask myself in different ways quite regularly. What do we want? What are our values? Because if we understand what our values are, principally what we actually want, then we can kind of work backwards from that. But if we slavishly following the most popular voices or the most attractive things, or we're dazzled by different things, or we're kind of caught up in the milieu, then there's a risk that not only do we become somebody else's quote unquote useful idiot, but we also end up in a bad way as a result of following a path that was never going to lead to the outcome that we really wanted anyway. And that's not about being preachy. That's just simply about cause and effect, consequences to actions. I mean, one of the things that we do lack of now, I suppose, in terms of the biblical aphorisms, is by their fruits shall ye know them. It's good to look at what people who espouse certain things, how does it work out for them? And there are so many different examples. That's what history does for us as well. It gives us so many examples of people who followed a certain course of action and where it led them, and then figure out, is that the life that you want? Are those the outcomes that you want? And make a decision from there.
yeah, it would be great if things always worked out really obviously badly for bad people.
They
But
don't. They don't. They don't
it's
always know.
Machiavelli is very clear, and all the ancients are very clear about that. If you just look at the lives of bad people, a lot of them sadly do die perfectly, okay in their beds without anyone having, managed to knock them off or make them suffer too much. So it's not enough. I mean, Machiavelli
Mm,
is not a totally consequentialist thinker. In other words, he doesn't judge the value of an action entirely by the outcome. And he says that pretty clearly, in spite of that famous
mm,
ends justify the means idea that gets associated with him. If you really read what he says, he's not saying, he's saying something very different. It's that there's so many ways you can evaluate the results of an action, and you might die apparently happy, but you've left a wreck for your successors who are often your sons. And you
Mm,
see so many times in history that, some tyrant dies really well. And he's like, right, I did this, but then his sons end up like murdering each other, and then all hell breaks loose and the whole place
mm,
and that sort of thing, and we see that in Singapore, now with Lee Kuan Yew. Everyone's like, I still hear people saying Lee Kuan Yew and that whole dynasty of one man like running this very wealthy city state. And I say, hang on, but you know what happened after he died? His sons
yeah,
stopped fighting each other, and now it's all turmoil. And a lot of young Singaporeans I know are miserable, and
mm,
really unhappy with the way things go. I do think it's so important for young. I think that again, we have an opportunity with a lot of younger people to really care about rethinking their values in their own way and not just taking them from
yes,
authority, because young people can look around them and see that on the level of politics, on the media, older people, full stop, mostly, are really confused and upset and stressed or just messed up. And so,
mm,
it's we didn't get when I was in my 20s, I was at, Oxford University, and most of my lovely, lovely fellow students, we were all sort of taught succeed, succeed, succeed. Here, all these, management consultants and businesses and government jobs, and everyone's out like dressing the right way and cutting their hair the right way and telling me I'm not dressing right or cutting my hair right because I wasn't that professionally interested. And a lot of them are happy, but I know a lot of people who ended up really being unhappy because they took so much pressure from outside. And I think, that's something that young people can hopefully take a big step back and listen to podcasts like yours and read Machiavelli again and what have
yeah,
you, and find ways forward with a lot more confidence that thinking for themselves is what we need now. And learning what you learn in universities about some 500-year-old guy, like Machiavelli, even the most lovely, wonderful professors, including myself, we don't get everything,
mm,
he's a difficult, ambiguous writer, full stop. If anyone tells you he's easy and that's what you're looking for, you won't get him, and you'll
mm.
get trouble, and your values will go in the wrong direction. So
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. So that's a really nice place to end it on then, Erica. I just want to remind people the title of this book that I've been referring to is Be Like the Fox, Machiavelli's Lifelong Quest for Freedom, and it is very, very well worth the read. It's a very entertaining book. It's a very informative book, and it does change the way that you look at the prince in future, and it certainly opened my eyes to a new way of reading Machiavelli. And just by the way, just as a final thought, I have actually recommended that some of these business school professors read your book on Machiavelli when they've quoted him in certain ways, because I think that the world would be much better off if people understood Machiavelli in a different way to the way that he's been assumed to have been or assumed to have wanted to communicate to the world about power. Because ultimately, like you say, or as Machiavelli said, fortune doesn't last forever. So you might get the quick win or the quick victory or the quick boost to your power through something in the short term. But the question is, what does it do to the long term? Because tomorrow will come at some point.
yeah.
So thank you so much for your time, Erica, on the Real Clear Values podcast.
Thank you. That was a really interesting discussion.